really careful attention to the materiality of the media that we're dealing with, then, and I believe this is actually one of the great strengths of ICEA and the electronic and digital arts in general, where serious attention is being paid. If we don't pay that kind of attention, then we are actually handing over control and over these media. This, I think, is actually happening actively in Rosalind Krauss's concept of the post-medium condition, with which I have the deepest antipathy. I believe that is a complete capitulation, as indeed is most neo-conceptual art, to the conditions of the market and to biopolitical management. On the contrary, what we need is digital, extremely medium-specific criticism. Not to say all digital media are, as I've been doing, which is a first sketch, but to say this particular work, using these particular tools, applications, software, display mechanisms, devices, practices, this very specific assemblage made for this work is utterly important. The tools that we use in a given work are critically important. So on the one hand, there is, I think, a universalizing practice in, let's say, the kind of infrastructure which we share with global finance and global governance. At the same time, there is the extremely specific way in which technique interacts with those technologies, changes them, and opens up their possibilities.
Yeah, I like very much this call of yours to specific elements in the work of art, digital work of art. But don't you think that's the case? Don't you think we are going against was the main line of thought in contemporary art? Contemporary art seems to be against all kinds of specifics. Call it back to the 20s and 30s, to Rosenberg or whatever. That's specific. Now, today there is no specific. Is it there?
Yeah, I very much so. I think well, we're now coming up to the anniversary. I think after 100 years, we could probably stop remaking Marcel Duchamp's Fountain of 1912 as if it was an entirely new and totally magical moment which defines the art practice of a generation. I think we've done it to death. And by and large, what I've seen in recent major art shows, that feeling is beginning to be fairly widespread. Certainly, I missed Venice, although I'm told that the same artwork which really shone at the British Art Show this year shone at Venice, which is Christian Marclay's Clock. But by and large, most people seem to think the rest of the show is pretty ho-hum. It seems to be very interesting that show in London, the only two artworks that really stood out as having any kind of sense of actuality or virtuality were Marclay's work, which is a masterpiece of editing, amongst many other things, and Tillman's extraordinary inkjet print. But the rest of the work, neo-conceptual stuff, frankly, was tired, jejune. So I think, yes, there is another moment, yet another moment in which we need to get over this. I think it's time for a new avant-garde, and I think I'm in its presence in this room. Someone over here.
Thank you. But to comment on what you just said, the time to live message that is being sent out 250 times or however many times is very much like Marcel Duchamp's message. It's just that it's being reinterpreted every time or repackaged. I do think that I'd like to know your comment about how you were to determine the time to live for the current messages that we're currently working on in terms of its future run. What is the time to live of the avant-garde you're speaking of now that you hope this room is generating?
Well, I think there are several people here who I would really rather deflect that question to. There are people who have pioneered this work, and I think, like Roy Ascott is here, and I think Mike Leggett, who've transformed the landscape, who've made it possible to work and think and imagine in such different ways. And I cannot really, when, God bless him, when Nicolas Bourgeaud was working on the relational aesthetic and some of his examples, you thought, but look at what Roy was doing 15 or 20 years ago, or what Linux have achieved, were achieving at that time. The paucity of ambition, the lack of political engagement, the metaphor that has become a metaphor of a metaphor, all of these things seem to be so weak compared to the practices that we see here or at ours, which really engage with change, really attempt to open up new futures. And that, I think, is where, I suppose, like most of us, I will, if possible, take a wander around the Istanbul Modern and see what's on show at the biennial, and no doubt there'll be pieces that I like. But I think that there is something about the basic rule of digital media arts, which is it has to work. We have, first and foremost, to be artisans, to understand our materials and to make things operate, and only then can you do the rest. And the best work, of course, is not just to use the tools that are available, but to transform them in these kinds of imaginative ways. So that, I guess, is where I'm at. I think the attempt to rise above materiality in the guise of the so-called concept is, it's rather like a subprime mortgage market. A really, really interesting concept, but unfortunately, for lack of any kind of reality, it's just not that satisfying.
I wonder if you think, when you're talking about materiality, that you're kind of reflecting back on the body, on the human body. I have this, first of all, I want to say that I don't think we need any more avant-gardes. I think we should lower the guard. What I want to say is that when you mentioned this wonderful Maori reference, and I've read it before in your work, and I think it's really, really effective, but I wonder how to implement it in a way that we can recognize our ancestors in our instruments, in our technology. And, we have this, in Serre, in Michel Serre, we have this notion of the layers of time that are all synchronous with us, right? That we're embodying previous generations in ourselves, in our language. This human materiality, and it relates to the future of the humanities in this context.
Two, in fact, three really immense questions. I think the first answer would be, I mentioned a couple of points in there, a bigger thesis that I'm beginning to work on for a future project, trying to develop an eco-criticism that's really worthy of the name, which is about this migration of things from the human side to the environmental side. So what do we mean by environment? One of those things, as I mentioned, was land, which still in indigenous cultures is a human thing, but for most of us, it's an alienable thing. The second was tools, and very clearly in the digital era, it's not in what was knowledge and has become information and is now increasingly kind of machine-readable, automated information, which creates an environment over against us. And I think what is currently occurring, and I fear, is that the human body is on the way to migrating from the human side of the equation to becoming an environment or a habitat in which whatever is left of us operates. So unlike the argument, I think is it Agamben makes, That when the medievals were trying to define the human started at the waist and everything below was the devil's. After Darwin, it's sort of like from the neck down is nature. After Freud, it's just the front of your face because the back there is all that's a weird word and stuff. So I think that's kind of that migration, and I fear that the human body is actually in process. So that the DNAization is becoming part of that process. The humanities, I think, have been their own worst enemy. I think they have pursued, for very understandable reasons, and I'm in many respects, although I migrated gradually towards social science, but I began in the humanities. I think what the pursuit of specialization, the use of the semicolon in Paradise Lost, has become the absolute enemy of what the humanities are for. The professional schools are there to look at how to create wealth or shelter or clothing or beautiful objects. The sciences are there to provide something like knowledge. The humanities are there to discuss the relative value of those things. That's what the humanities ought to be for, but they have failed, I think, with honourable exceptions, very dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years, to do exactly that, to provide the place in which values can be discussed, and where we can discuss values that do not appear, and health appears in the sort of governmental calculation, but beauty very rarely does. There's a very bogus attempt to include happiness as a quantifiable measure in British governance at the moment, which is a very, very frightening one. And it's able to happen, however, because the humanities have failed to address that. I think the crisis is largely self-generated, and I think it's really important that we stop doing that and begin to put some colours on our sleeves, preferably red and green.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to Sean Cubitt. Now it's lunch time. There are several locations just outside the towers where you can go, you can explore, and there are two very big malls, and you have the food blog by Feter. If you had time to read it before coming here, you should have a few clues. Just a reminder, the location today is going to be Cabotage for the boat, and you could be there at 5 o'clock. It's very, very easy, because what you do is you just take the subway, then from the subway you take the funicular that takes you down to Cabotage. So you don't even have to get out of the underground, it's just an underground system. And then from there is the ferry dock, and there will be the boat, and you will see us looking there. Thank you so much, and then thank you.